He can sleep almost indefinitely and is probably the laziest person in England, was how journalist Maureen Cleave described John Lennon in early '66. Physically lazy, John protested. I don't mind writing, reading, watching, or speaking. This passage perfectly captures John's lifestyle at the time, hidden in Kenwood, watching the wheels go round and round, dreaming his life away. It was not uncommon for Paul to wake him up for a writing session. Often, he would be John's morning alarm call. John led a more relaxed suburban life, but if he went to dinner in London or to a club, living so far from town meant that he returned home very late. Paul would arrive at midday or early afternoon and wake him up, which was how John got the idea for I'm Only Sleeping, someone being awakened against their will and wanting to go back to bed. The lyric, "Please don't wake me, no, don't shake me," is most likely directed at Paul, who just wants to get his grind on. That's me dreaming my life away, John once said about the tune. Though John claims he wrote it alone, Paul says in his book many years from now that it was co-written but from John's original idea. One day I led the dance, like Paperback Writer, and another day John would lead the dance, like I'm Only Sleeping. It was nice. We weren't really competitive as to who started the song. It was a nice idea. I'm not being lazy, I'm only sleeping, I'm having a lay. The luxury of all of that was what it was about, Paul said. John and Paul only wrote in between making albums. Not much was put on paper in the months prior, and now it was time to deliver the goods for the new album, Revolver.
The only time we've got to do that, when we've got to actually sort of force ourselves to write it, is when we've got an LP coming up or we've got a film coming up or something. Then it's a bit of a drag for the first, say, 2 songs, because you really got to, in fact, the last LP, wow, we took weeks just trying to get one written, to get back into the swing of it, because we don't write in between LPs normally. Maybe just write sort of 1 or 2, and then we have a great big batch.
In the studio, I'm Only Sleeping made its debut on April 27th at 11:30 p.m. on EMI Studio 3. Their actual tiredness after a long day's work was undoubtedly appropriate to the occasion. A yawn from Paul was even added just before the last bridge. We tried to get the vocals to sound like somebody's asleep, which is very difficult, George said. Recording was begun after a break for mixing the tracks already taped for the LP. This was the first such session the Beatles had ever attended until then, an indication of how more concerned they were becoming with the integrity of the new sound they were crafting. In about 24 hours of recording spread over 4 days, they worked hard to obtain the timbres they wanted, using Verispeed to alter frequencies. The thin papery vocals John wanted were obtained by a process of speeding up and down, which ended with the track a semitone below its original key of E minor. The Beatles had done a lot of that by this time. The most important of the effects used was no doubt the very first backwards guitar heard in pop music history, created by George during a painstaking 6-hour session. Having worked out his Indian-style guitar line normally, he had George Martin transcribe it in reverse and then record it, dubbing the result backwards. This effect became irresistible to musicians all across the world, with many eager to imitate it, including Jimi Hendrix in Are You Experienced? Yes, recordings using backward sounds were not invented by the Beatles. Avant-garde composers like Karlheinz Stockhausen or John Cage achieved this in the 50s. But it was they who brought this invention to a wider audience. And it was not just reversing tapes either. They were eager to keep pushing the envelope, and with much help from the EMI staff, they took all the time necessary to perfect it. I'm Only Sleeping was one especially tedious session where we all wished we had never come up with the concept of backward sounds, Geoff Emerick once said. George was determined to play a backwards guitar solo on it. At the best of times, he had trouble playing solos all the way through forwards, so it was with great trepidation that we all settled in for what turned out to be an interminable day of listening to the same 8 bars played backwards over and over and over again. According to George, they actually experimented with backwards guitar during the making of Rain on April 14th of that year, though the results were either omitted or buried in the mix. According to Paul, when George was trying to record backwards guitar for I'm Only Sleeping on May 5th, the tape operator put the tape on tails out, which impressed the Beatles when they heard it. It played backwards, Paul said, as if this was the first time they heard backwards guitars. He continued, "What the hell's going on? Those effects! Nobody knew how those sounded then. We said, my God, this is fantastic. Can we do that for real?" So George Martin, being open to ideas like that, said, "Yes, sure, I think we can do that." So that was what we did, and that was where we discovered backwards guitar. It sounds like something you couldn't play.
John got a spool of tape of the rough mix of the backing track to I'm Only Sleeping, and he didn't realize because the tape was tails out, and they just stuck it on a reel, and he put it on his tape machine and threaded the tail in forward and got it backwards. That's when he came in the next day and said, "Oh, yeah, backwards." And then we made him turn the tape over, play it backwards, and we all played, I think John and I, or Paul and I, played guitars, just like random notes on the guitars. And then we turned the tape back over to see what we had, and that was like the first time we had a backwards solo.
The Beatles were clearly not interested anymore in simulating their live sound in the studio, instead creating a sonic environment for each track. In November 2022, the Beatles produced an animated video for I'm Only Sleeping to coincide with the reissue of Revolver, and it won Best Music Video at the Grammy Awards.
Oh yes, these songs. Do you prefer writing at night? Are you night workers?
No, any time really. You know, when you're awake, not too near the morning when you're half asleep, and not when you're tired. So it doesn't matter what time it is, but just the period when you feel quite healthy.
Do you both have to be in the right mood when you're working together, collaborating on a song? Does one have to wait for the other to
Very
start?
seldom, you know. If we both don't feel like it, we just have another ciggy.
John must have liked I'm Only Sleeping quite well, as he wrote a sequel, if you will, years later, Watching the Wheels. He was often accused of being lazy, perhaps compared to someone like Paul, but with a career as prolific as his and only 40 years of life, you could hardly call him that. Perhaps he was not the lazy one, and it's us who are moving too fast for no reason at all.